The budget blowouts keep on coming at Victoria Police. The biggest law enforcement agency in the country spent $31 million on external lawyers last year, despite employing more than 600 sworn officers and public servants in its own legal department. But wait, it gets worse. Now, after putting its hand out for more than $175 million in terms of a bailout for the Andrews government earlier this year, it's been revealed that Victoria Police hired more than 200 contractors last year at an additional cost of more than $100 million. The Australian's Victorian editor, Damon Johnston's all over this story. He joins me now from Melbourne. Thank you for your time, Damon. Of course, this isn't just extra funding to cope with the demands of pandemic policing, is it? It's extra millions on top of what has already been spent, and these blowouts are fairly extreme.
Good to be here, Peter. Yes, so we know that Victoria Police had to get emergency funding from the Victorian government, well, essentially the Victorian taxpayers, we should remember that. That was to cover overtime bills, etc., largely due to the pandemic, but they've got some underlying problems. It's Australia's biggest police force. It costs $1 billion a year to run. Now, what we reported this morning were details of more than $200 million of expenditure for consultants and contractors. Now, some of those expenditures had to happen. You know, that included $30 or $40 million to keep the helicopters in the air and the fixed-wing aircraft in the air. So clearly that expenditure is reasonable. You don't want the police helicopters falling out of the air. However, as you correctly pointed out, more than $30 million went to some of the biggest law firms in the country.
So I'm just asking the question, I think it's extraordinary. Why so much money on external lawyers?
Yeah, good question. So the financial records that were released to the Australian yesterday by Victoria Police don't detail the why. They detail the how much and the who. So what it shows is that some of the biggest law firms, Cause Chambers got more than $13 million. Maddox got a couple of $100,000. The Victorian Government Solicitor's Office that runs a lot of their prosecutions charged Victoria Police more than $10 million. There's a lot of barristers' chambers were pulling in well over $1 million. Now, we don't know whether they were for individual barristers or for several barristers. One can assume, and I think pretty safely, that a large part of that legal expense was related to potentially the Lawyer X scandal and various other sort of own goals that Victoria Police have kicked for themselves.
Well, we know with the Coate inquiry, we know the Premier had his own law firm and counsel. We know all the other ministers had law firm and counsel. We know then the former police chief, who was the police chief at the time, had his own counsel. You know, all the various departments had their own law firms and counsels. They weren't using the government solicitor office. They were all using external multi-million-dollar law firms. But, you know, you're right, it's a $4.1 billion behemoth, Victoria Police, most expensive in the country. Taxpayers getting a fair deal here? Well,
I guess that's the question, isn't it? You know, running a police force is expensive. You have to accept that. A lot of this money, the budget blowouts, was for extra protective equipment, extra PPE. All of this was necessary expenditure. You know, the police didn't have any choice but to enforce the laws as laid down by the Andrews government. So clearly that involved a lot of overtime, a lot of extra police policing the protests, etc., some of whom were very violent. So, you know, necessarily this is going to cost money. But what this shows is that there seems to be an open checkbook when it comes to lawyers. And often those lawyers, I believe, are employed to help the police manage and even potentially cover up some of the big scandals that they've got themselves involved in, such as the Lawyer X affair.